Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension, Cooperative Extension. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Public Radio, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mark Langenfeld and Tamara Thomsen. Tamara's with the Wisconsin Historical Society and was born in Bethesda, Maryland, and went to high school at Carmel High School near Indianapolis, Indiana. She came to UW-Madison to get her undergraduate degree in horticulture and agronomy, stayed here to get a master's degree in plant breeding, and then, like most people who get degrees in plant biology like myself, went to work for the Wisconsin Historical Society. Which is where she's been since 2004. And Mark Langenfeld was born in Racine, Wisconsin, as was my dad. He went to Washington Park High School, as did my dad, and I understand everybody just calls it Park High School, is that correct?
That's right.
And came to UW-Madison to get a degree in journalism. And the Department of Journalism was at what location?
About where we're standing. It was in the old Wisconsin High Building, 425 Henry Mall.
Yep, so it was here at 425 Henry Mall before this building was put up in 1995. And then he got his law degree here at UW-Madison in 1985. They are going to talk to us about one of the more extraordinary stories I've seen in a long time. Diving into the flooded mines of Baraboo's Iron Range is what I call it. I think they're calling it an archaeological analysis of the mines of the Baraboo Iron Range. So please join me in welcoming both Tamara Thomsen and Mark Langenfeld to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Well, candidly, I'm stunned to see this many faces, and it's been kind of cold, and I didn't know whether there'd be one or none, or certainly didn't expect this many. So thanks for coming out, and we hope we'll make this presentation worth your while. It's a little unusual. The Baraboo iron mines. Well, who'd have thunk? Baraboo. And my job here, I'm not a diver. Well, I am a diver, but I'm not one of the divers that is doing the work in the mines. I'm here to provide a geological and historical context for the amazing stuff that Tammy's going to show you in a little while. So let's get to that. If you're really interested in this subject, I'm going to start right out by pointing you at probably the best extant resource on the iron mines of the Baraboo Range. This was an issue that volume 36, number 4, December 2003 of the Midcontinent Railway Gazette. I don't know if any of you have been up to the Midcontinent Railway Museum in North Freedom, but they have a very nice publication. It's a quarterly usually. This was a special issue that they put out specifically on the iron mines up there. And they did so because the rail line on which the museum train operates is actually the same rail lines that service these mines. This particular rail line was put in to service these iron mines. So if you find yourself stimulated and excited about this and you want more information, this particular issue has been reprinted and is available at the museum, probably by email order if you go to their website. I haven't checked that, so I don't know. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, and I have to learn how to use this mouse, the fact of the matter is, few people connect Baraboo with mining. I mean, you think of Devil's Lake State Park, you think of Circus World Museum, you think of the ties with the Ringling Brothers, but you don't think of mining. You just don't. But one thing that maybe you have heard of, certainly most geologists practicing in this area know about, is a thing called the Baraboo syncline. Now, I'm not going to get too technical here, but basically what a syncline is a big deformation of the bedrock. If you have a major disturbance where you have pressure in the bedrock moving inward, one of two things can happen. The bedrock can buckle upward and create a thing called an anticline, or it can buckle downward and create a thing called a syncline. And what we have in the Baraboo area is a big geological feature called a syncline, the bedrock buckled downward. I think, I'm not a geologist, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express, you know that. I think there's still legitimate debate on what forces caused that syncline to occur. I think there's general agreement that it was about 1.8 billion years ago. I could be off by a fraction of a billion, but about 1.8 billion years ago, some force from the south-southeast and some counter force from the north-northwest, exerting enough force to actually buckle these rocks. What an astounding thing that must have been, and it probably occurred over a long period of time. But there it is. This is the remnant of that event, or those events. And just to give you, I'm going to use this little cursor here. The city of Baraboo lies right about in here. This syncline, if you can envision it, is kind of a squat canoe. You get the picture. Baraboo kind of sits up here in the bow, and LaRue, where we're going to be doing a lot of work, kind of sits semi toward the stern down in the canoe. All right, now if you think of cutting a cross section through the syncline north and south, roughly along the line of Highway 12, going north and south, this is roughly what it looks like. Now, once upon a time, all these beds of rocks were pretty much horizontal. But when that smashing force occurred, it got forced into this sort of a canoe, for lack of a better word. And looking at the cross section, this would be the North Range here, what's called the North Range, and the South Range over here. That would sort of be the gunnels of the canoe. And what's in here is sort of in the bilges. Okay, you get the picture? Now, initially, that North Range and that South Range were a good deal higher. In fact, you could even argue that they were mountainous. We're looking at, I think, now the geologists may pillory me here, but I think there was at least 1,000 feet of relief and probably quite a bit more than that. Those over the years were eroded by various forces. They were weathered down into the outcrops of Baraboo quartzite that you see today. Devil's Lake is probably the most classic of the outcrops. And this Baraboo quartzite is good stuff. It's very old, very tough rock. It's been quarried for many, many years at North Freedom. If you see this characteristic pinkish rock used as railroad ballast along railroad right-of-ways, that's the so-called Pink Lady rock that's been quarried at North Freedom for many years. It's very old, very tough rock. The formations which used to overlie that Baraboo quartzite were pretty much stripped away by erosional forces and glaciation. But the thing is you've got this syncline, and it has a bilge in it, and it sort of trapped those overlying formations right in this area. So they're kind of preserved there, but they've disappeared everywhere else. They've just been ground away, washed away, and so on and so forth. What color is the Baraboo quartzite? Anybody? No? Red. I heard a red. Yeah, reddish purple. What does that indicate to you? Iron. Yeah, there's iron up there somewhere. And sure enough, there's actually iron formation. By the way, iron is everywhere. Iron is everywhere through the Midwest, through the world, everywhere. The question is, how rich is the iron? Is it economic? Turns out that in one of these bilge formations, if you want to call it that, is a thing called the Freedom Dolomite. And adjacent to that Freedom Dolomite is a pretty thick, pretty rich iron formation. All right, that's trapped in the synclinal basin. Now, small deposits of that, small outcrops of that were discovered and mined pretty early on, primarily for use as pigment in paint. You want to know why Wisconsin barns are painted red? Iron pigment paint is extremely durable. It's extremely cheap. There are several places in Wisconsin where iron paint was manufactured. This was one. There's another over near Iron Ridge. Does that ring a bell? You know what I'm talking about? Between here and Hartford. Remember where Hartford is? There's a little place called Iron Ridge. There's a place called Mayville. They tried to smelt the iron over there, but it turned out to be very brittle iron, so it wasn't useful for that, but they sure did make a lot of paint. But anyway, they were mining for paint up here as early as the 1880s. All right, let me recover my cursor here. Now, some other people had bigger ideas for Baraboo iron. They started prospecting for higher grade ores in about 1887, but it was a little on the disorganized side. What you're looking at here is a steam drill. Steam drilling, core drilling, was pioneered by a chap by the name of Longyear. Long story, I won't get into it, in the Minnesota Iron Ranges. This is a Longyear type core drill. Right around the turn of the last century, 1900, a chap from Minnesota by the name of G.W. LaRue brought down his steam drills, core drills, and crews and began prospecting deeper for richer ores. And they found it. And it wasn't all that deep. It was within the first 300-400 feet from surface, which is important when you're talking economics. They were greatly encouraged by this, and LaRue and his partners formed an outfit called the Sauk County Land and Mining Company, and they called it that because obviously they had to acquire land that had rich mineral deposits underneath it. And they soon started reporting finding deposits of greater than 50% ore, which is, you know, iron is not like gold. I mean, you're not going to make a huge amount of money out of it. So the richer it is, the more economic it is to develop. So when they said, we've got ore here that's better than 50% iron, antennae went out. The other thing that worked in their favor is the Chicago Northwestern Railroad already had rails into this area. So the combination of LaRue's finds and rail service made it seem like almost a sure thing. And there was great excitement, and the boom was on. LaRue and his cohorts immediately began leasing land for mineral development around the area. One of the first to take them up on it was an outfit called Deering Harvester out of Chicago. Now they manufactured farm equipment, and we'll get into that in a minute. They were looking for a fairly nearby source of iron ore that they could take to Chicago and smelt into iron for their farm implements, the manufacture of their farm implements. They formed, and I mean Deering Harvester, formed the Illinois Mining Company in 1901. And they came up and they started doing some drilling of their own. By that time, they had merged and acquired some other businesses and were known as International Harvester. That should ring a bell with you. They finally leased land for a mine in 1903. About the same time as this, and by the way, I should move on to the next slide here. No, that's not working. There we go. All right. Okay, very good. About the same time, the Iroquois Iron Company, which was also affiliated with a Chicago steel mill, acquired some property about a mile away. And they also leased that land, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. So anyway, after a couple of false starts, the Illinois mine reached its final configuration in And you can see here the head frame on the Illinois mine, and there's some rails in it that kind of go down. Oops, I'm not tracking them very well. They go down on an angle, about like that. They sank a 400-foot shaft that went down about a 60-degree angle into the ground. So this is not a minor operation. As you can see, there was a fairly substantial investment in infrastructure, and the mine was pretty deep, 400 feet. Now this picture was taken circa 1907, so this is actually fairly late in the mine's life. It's pretty mature in this image. This is a schematic cross-section of the mine. You can see the 60-degree incline shaft. Goes down to a cross-cut at the 300. Oops. Let me go back. Goes down to a cross-cut. Sorry. I don't know if that's a problem with dry hands or what it is. I have lost my cursor. I'm gonna point with a laser pointer, which I'm sorry for those of you streaming won't be able to see this, but if you follow down the incline, oh, there it is. There it is. She's got different hands than I do. There's a cross cut at the 300-foot level, and look at that. All right. And the plan view there shows the cross cut at the 300-foot level, which goes out into the ore formation, and then they proceeded east and west along the ore formation, stoping it out and removing it and hoisting it to surface. They also went down to the 400-foot level, drove a similar crosscut into the ore body. They had to go a little farther and stoped east and west and removed the ore. Now, the 400-foot level was a little thicker, but the ore was slightly lower grade. But that'll give you a general idea how the mine was laid out. And let's see if I can make this work. Up here is where that head frame and shaft was located in the image. The ore was a soft red hematite. It was easy to mine, and reportedly it smelted very well. International Harvester was pleased. Now, at its peak, this mine was operating 24/7, 3 shifts a day. There were 200 employees. They were Finnish, German, Swedish, and Englishmen, mostly Cornishmen. I don't know if you know about the connection of Cornwall and Cornishmen to mining, but it's a very close one. It was a very busy place. Tammy will show you some images, I think, that show you the string town of miners' housing that grew up just to the south of the mine. The mine had a hotel on site. It was a big operation, and it was well financed by International Harvester. In mid-1904, the mine was shipping about 4 of these 40-ton rail cars of ore to Chicago for smelting. And by the end of that year, they were already increasing their production to between 5 and 12 of those carloads per day. So that was a fairly hefty tonnage considering the practices that were used, which was largely hand mining at that time. It was not heavily mechanized. This was purely pick, shovel, dynamite, and the strength of men's backs. This is a photograph of the mine's very first shipment in 1904. You can see it went out with some ballyhoo. And again, these are the tracks that are used today by the Midcontinent Museum. So there's some real connection. You can also see that LaRue was a fairly booming little community at that time. They had platted this community out for immense growth. Of course, it never happened, but they had it planted. Well, the fact of the matter is, despite the ballyhoo, despite the labor, despite the production, they never made a penny on this mine. It was basically a loser. And they applied their best efforts, both technologically and in terms of dedicated labor, but it just did not work out. By 1908, operations were suspended, and the mine never reopened. Existing ore, however, was continued to be sold off the stockpiles until about 1916, when it was essentially depleted. By 1925, every stick of that structure, every stick of every bit of the equipment, every stick of the structure had either been removed or repurposed. It was gone. The site basically was indistinguishable as a mine. Now, the Iroquois Mining Company that I mentioned a moment ago began erecting buildings and sinking a shaft in 1903. Now, they were targeting an ore body that was quite deep, about 500 feet, but it had shown up in drill cores, exploration drill cores, at 63% ore. I mean, it really looked good. However, the company had difficulties with financing and also some engineering problems, so they suspended operations by the end of 1904, and the project lay dormant for 4 years. In March of 1908, the Oliver Mining Company, which is a subsidiary of United States Steel, acquired the whole property, the whole shooting match, and they renamed it the Iroquois Mine, and they revived the project with substantial financial backing, which their predecessor just didn't have. And that money built a really thoroughly modern stone and brick powerhouse, big brick smokestack that you see here, a substantial steel head frame that you can see in the background, along with a loading trestle that ran across at right angles, a major ore bin for holding raw ore that came up from underground, and they built an absolutely spectacular residence for their mine superintendent. And by the way, that is the only structure I know of that has survived. It was removed from the site and has been relocated in rural Sauk County and can still be seen today. But I kind of got ahead of myself here a little bit. You have to note the scale and sophistication of what's going on here at this mine site. I mean, it really mirrored the mining practice of northern Minnesota and upper Michigan, where the mining was extremely high tech, and everything was the best that money could buy. Quite different from the lead and zinc mines in southwestern Wisconsin, which were much smaller and by comparison basically primitive. It's quite a contrast. The Baraboo Republic reported in November 1909, and I'm going to quote it now, and this is in reference to the Iroquois mine. All improvements being made about the place are of a permanent character and indicate that the ore under the ground is of vast extent and will require years to bring to the surface. Well, that wasn't the way it turned out. Continuous difficulties from the start. The Oliver Company abruptly stopped operations in May of 1914 and within months had dismantled and completely removed everything you see here. Everything was gone. So much for permanence. Well, just across the road from the Illinois mine that we looked at first, Captain C.T. Roberts, who was the last superintendent at the Illinois mine before it closed, later opened a small, short-lived mine that bore his name. We're going to be talking more about this mine. And if you look in the background there, you can see the inactive Illinois head frame. So it's very close. It's just across the road. And the connection between C.T. Roberts, this mine, and the Illinois mine is an interesting connection that we are going to explore a little bit later. Now, I also want to briefly mention the last and largest of the Baraboo Range iron mines. This is the Cahoon Mine, and it was an outlier. It was not in the North Freedom, LaRue area. This one was actually almost within the city limits of Baraboo. It was opened by Pittsburgh Steel and coal investors in 1911. And it operated on 2 shifts almost continuously until 1919. And the shaft was sunk to 400 feet, and it had extensive multiple levels running east and west. Now, although the mining ended at the Cahoon in 1919, there was huge stockpiles of iron ore just below the mine, and there was continuous shipment of that ore until 1925. But that is the end of iron mining in Sauk County. I mentioned earlier that the Illinois mine had a couple of false starts before settling in on that 400-foot, 60-degree incline. I want to talk just a little bit about that. Initially, they tried sinking vertical shafts directly from the surface down to the iron ore body, as you can sort of see here. You can see how different the incline was. The incline went down at an angle, and they had to drive cross cuts to reach the iron ore. Their original intent was to sink a vertical shaft straight down from the surface and hit the ore body right at the top. Well, they tried 2 of these vertical shafts, but abandoned both of them before reaching the ore, at least so far as we know before reaching the ore. We don't really know why they abandoned that and went to the other, although it was about coincidental with the arrival of Captain C.T. Roberts, who came down from Crystal Falls, Michigan. And he said, we're going to sink the incline shaft, and they did. Now, here's an image of one of those early vertical shaft sinking attempts. And you can see in the foreground a nice set of steam boilers and a hoist, and in the background a very crude temporary head frame. And the head frame is nothing more than a scaffold that holds a sheave wheel that the hoist rope goes over so that you can hoist straight up and down the shaft. Now, I want to digress just a little bit here and talk a little bit about shaft sinking circa turn of the last century, because this is going to play a little part in Tammy's story, more than a little part. This is a drawing from a roughly 1908, 1909 mining treatise of a shaft sinking operation. Now, steam power was big at the turn of the last century. Industry of any kind, mining included, relied entirely on steam for power. Compressed air was just starting to come in, mostly for drilling, but power was steam. Now this is the shaft, way over here on the right. I'm doing a terrible job of this. This is the shaft going down to water. And you see a device down here at the bottom of the shaft, and that is a pump. In the vernacular of the mining industry, that was called a sinking pump. They're sinking the shaft, and to keep the mine dry so they can work on it as they go deeper and deeper, they have a portable pump that goes down on a hoist. It's like a sump pump. And they run this to the bottom of the shaft and pump the water out of the sump or the bottom of the shaft. The problem with steam power, though, is it does not hold its energy for great distances. So this pump did not have sufficient capacity to raise that water all the way to surface. What they did was they excavated a pocket off the side of the shaft, partway down, built a sump into the floor of that pocket, and put in a much larger pumping engine at that level. What that allowed them to do is use the sinking pump to raise the water to the sump in that pumping station, and the more powerful pump would then pump that water to surface. So it was essentially a 2-stage pumping operation. Everybody bored now? Yeah, very good. Yes. Anyway, this is another picture of a typical sinking pump of that era. And I'm showing this to you only as a teaser for what is to come. All right. What killed the mines? Water. Okay? All of these mines were underwater. All right? We're going to look at this diagram here again. You see this whole formation here. Up here is glacial drift. This is just stuff deposited by departing glaciers. But this formation right here, which overlies all of the iron formation in this district, is called the Potsdam Sandstone. It's a very porous sandstone, and it is saturated. It's like a sponge. So if you try to work under the Potsdam Sandstone, water comes down and down and down and tries to flood you out. There's a lot of water in 400 vertical feet of this porous rock. All right. So they had to pump continuously to stay ahead of that water. In the Illinois mine, 2,600 gallons per minute. That cost dollars, a lot of dollars. And of course what that did is went to the bottom line, and it made the Baraboo iron ores less economic than certain others. Now, the Sauk Iroquois mine also was very wet, and that created another unforeseen problem. Their ore, as you recall, 63% ore, looked really good on those drill cores. But when they got underground, they found that that iron ore was so saturated it was literally sweating water. And it was like red mud. When mined, it became what one reporter called a pasty mess. It was difficult to handle, it was difficult to process. The Sauk mine also had to deal with pumping water. They had to extract 6.5 million gallons a day out of that mine to keep it dry. It required 13 underground pumps to do that. So I'll give you a notion of the scale. I want to give you a notion of just how wet it was, and it can be gleaned from an account of the mine's closure. And in the July 25th, 1914 edition of Mining and Engineering World, I know it's difficult to read, this vividly describes the battle with water, and I'll read you just a bit of it. Because with the machinery stopped, the mine was sure to be inundated within a few hours. Great care and the greatest of expedition were required to recover the equipment too valuable to abandon. A bulkhead was constructed, bolts were loosened, and other preparations were made to get the pumps out of the mine in quick order, one at a time, once the hoisting was started. So well did the plans work out that only 2 small machines were left in the workings. The last pump taken out was in operation until within a few minutes of time, when, slung in its chains, it was taken to the surface. The bulkhead, 7 feet in height, was engulfed so quickly the men barely had time to escape the rising flood. So, I mean, there are wet mines and there are wet mines. This was a wet mine. Well, water of a different sort also helped sound the death knell of the Baraboo iron mines, specifically the Great Lakes. The growing Great Lakes bulk carrier fleet made it feasible for the immense iron mines in northern Minnesota and upper Michigan to efficiently transport their ores down to the steel mills at the foot of the lakes. At first, the Baraboo ores could compete. They could be shipped to Chicago by rail for as little as 85 cents per ton. And initially, in accounting for docking charges, the maritime shipments of the northern ores cost nearly as much. So the Baraboo mines were initially competitive, but as the size of the average laker or ore boat increased and the cost of operating them started to go down, that advantage quickly flip-flopped. For example, as early as 1906, the Minnesota Mesabi range ores were being delivered by boat at International Harvester's Dock, fully a 45-cent per ton advantage over the Illinois mine ores. The Baraboo ores just could not compete. In short, water destroyed these mines. But in a sense, it also preserved them. They are today like sunken historic shipwrecks, except they're underground shipwrecks. And this is now where Tammy is going to take you. Thank you.
So if you give me a second here, I'm going to switch over the PowerPoint to mine here. So this is now. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how we got involved with this. We have a really active cave diving community here in Wisconsin, which is kind of surprising to a lot of people. But we have about 70 divers who are full cave diver trained. So it takes an awful lot of training, not just your basic open water training, but they learn to use technical diving equipment, and they take many levels, many years of advanced training to be able to dive in caves. And so normally or typically when people learn to cave dive, they dive in the Floridian Aquifer, or they go to Mexico and dive in the cenotes there. But when you're stranded in Wisconsin in the middle of winter, you start looking for any kind of water that you can dive in. So we see my friend Jason here hiking through a cornfield in southwestern Wisconsin trying to find one of these mine sites. So we started, because of our interest in caving and our familiarity with the Langenfelds, Mark and Lynn Langenfeld, we started asking them about a number of mine sites that they would know might still be open or accessible. And we started going through their collection of information that they had been gathering for a many number of years. And we've been pretty successful in talking to landowners and sharing information on what treasures they have on their properties. So with their help, we discovered one of the mines in the Baraboo Range. This is the Illinois mine, or the shaft entrance to the Illinois, and this was one of the early ones that we found around 2007 up there. So granted, we had been looking at mines and working with the Langenfelds for almost 20 years. And this was kind of in the middle of our hunt for mines. And so this is on the Pierce property. You see Dennis Pierce here and Keith Meverton, who's also in the audience. And we're looking at a 3-compartment shaft, which is the Illinois. Now, of course, Mark had been talking to you about the Illinois mine being one of the highest producing mines in the Baraboo Range. And this is really kind of an anomaly in their backyard. The Pierces had raised up the ground around where the shaft collar is here, and added a few railroad ties to prevent the wetland from taking over this area. And it really became an area for them to sit around and drink beers and party in their backyard. So since the mine closed in 1908, that's been the common thread with this shaft. There's been a lot of trash dumped in it. So we found many generations of trash. We found farming equipment which had been there, and when we removed that, there were beer cans from many generations, and then when you got on top of that, there were laptop computers and other indiscretions people wanted to hide by throwing them down the mine shaft. It took us about 7 years to remove everything from this, to be able to clear out what it was that we found. And we did take a number of notes. This ends up being a 3-compartment shaft. So it's basically a 3-compartment elevator shaft. And you're in an area that's enclosed for the most of it in each one of those individual segments, which is 5 feet by 4 feet. So it's very enclosed. And if you think about this, the central area really would be where the main elevator would run, and then there would be a switching manway, which would move from one side to the other. So if the elevator, or if the lift would break, they could come up on the ladders, and it wouldn't affect that. So we have a couple interesting things that you can see in this drawing, and this is one of our early sketches that we did underwater. So in that 7 years of us, this was not like every day we would go up there and remove this. This was very sporadic. But we would go up, a group of 4 or 5 of us, we would drop down one of the shafts and pull up a great big bag of trash, and then it would make the visibility and the clarity of the water mud. And so then the next person would come down, and they would fill a bag of trash by feel, and by the time the 4th person was down there, they were having no fun. And then it would take about a month for it to settle out, and then we would decide when we would want to go back up and try it all over again. And so I lost a good number of buddies, and eventually we got to the point where we could create something like this and see what we have. But you see, we've cleared it down to 130 feet. We know from the drawings that Mark was showing us earlier that this possibly could have gone as deep as 400 feet. So what lie below? Did we hit a debris clog? Had we just needed to remove more? Had we hit the bottom? What is there? But we see that there's a chain fall that we find at 95 feet. There's lagging, which is spelled out in here. And I wanted to share a little video from my friend John Jansen, who's also in the audience here, of what it looks like in the Illinois mine. So they've now added fence around it. It looks a little bit like a cemetery, but that was to prevent the grandchildren from falling into the open shaft. I know. And so you see that it's much nicer than the trash pit that it was 7 years prior. You can see that it's very clean. We've spent a lot of time knocking a lot of the debris off or gathering it up and clearing it out. And you can see the lagging is open around the outside of the entire structure with the frames down the center. As we progress deeper, and again, remember the Pierce family built this up higher to reinforce it. So we get down into the actual mine. You start seeing ladders in the south side of the compartment here, and we're going down in the center. And then as we get down to about 40 feet, it closes in. And so you need to choose which side you're in, whether you're in the central shaft or one side or the other. You also see coming in on the far side of the screen parts of the skip guides. So these would have been the guides. They would have been greased, and then the platform or the elevator would have come up and down on these to bring workers down or to bring ore back up. There's one of the skip guides there. And you can see it's quite substantially built. So they put a lot of investment into this particular shaft, and you see there's still some particulate in the water that gets knocked down despite our best efforts. And John's down at about 50 feet here looking up. He's just down into the enclosed area, and he's going to continue down in a second here. So as he continues down, now he's in the area that's enclosed in, and he's looking down the elevator shaft. So this is really an elevator shaft, and you're going straight down with the skips on either side. And this drops down to around the 100-foot level where it opens up again. You can see that it's routed out on the one side. I would imagine that's where where there would have been a braking mechanism to slow down the skip. So as we come down a little bit further, again, this is about 4 feet by 5 foot wide, and he's dropping through. So you can imagine this was all filled with trash. So each one of the 3 compartments. So again, it's a good number of times. So here we are. We open up into this other area, and now you can access either side of the 3-compartment shaft. And you can slip under the beams there and go into the other compartment and look in, or you can continue to drop down to the debris cone below. And you can see that some of the lagging has come free. So over the years, and if you look through that, you can either see that the rock wall has been gobbed behind it, so they've thrown rock in behind it, or you can see the rock walls. That is a hanger from one of the ladders that's fallen and has since dropped down to the bottom. So we had one of our divers get his fin caught in that little area and ended up abandoning it, and we had to go back about a month later and look for it. So John now drops under the wall here, and he comes across this pump. Now you imagine for 7 years we had no idea this pump was there because it was completely covered with garbage. And so it's pretty unique. This is actually a sinking pump, and it's in place. And it's interesting that he's so close to it, but remember, this shaft is 4 by 5, and now he's in the shaft with the pump. and his monster camera. And so that's why you're getting extremely close-up views. And you see the chain fall at the top as he continues up this shaft, which is attached to one of the beams. So then as the water level would have been depleted, they would have lowered the pump down, and then it would have been able to get more. We'll come back to that mosaic in a minute. So now he's following up. He's crossed over into the north side of the three-compartment shaft, and he's continuing up. And as he comes up to about the 75-foot level, the lagging will stop, and you see the flange at the end of a pipe, which has been disconnected. This goes into that pocket that Mark was talking about earlier, that where the stage pumping machinery would have been. So he heads back into this area, and again you see that the visibility in the water has been disturbed because he went down the shaft before he came back up. And he's going to head into this room following the pipe on the ceiling. And you can see that there are boards that are across the ceiling to prevent any loose rock from falling in on the workers. And as he gets all the way back into this room, you can see that there's a false floor or remnants of it. And this would have been where the sump would have been underneath, and they would have put the siphon to be able to suck up to go up to the surface. So that's the staged pumping room. So I'm going to head on here and show you. This is the mosaic of the pump. Again, this is taken from images that John shot in his video. And this is about 10 or 12 images, which I've stitched together to give you an overall feeling of that pump. And going back to the drawing that Mark showed you earlier, it is this sinking pump, which is here. And this remains all the way up to the connection going into this room, which comes in and goes in here. And then it's disconnected at this point right here, and the whole pumping mechanism has gone. So they either removed it or reutilized it somewhere else. Keep that in mind.
Tammy, you might want to give them a sense of how tall that pump is. Okay,
so that pump is about 30 feet tall. So it's very, very long. So the siphon on the sinking pump is all the way at the bottom at 130 feet of water. So, and that still is extant at the site. Okay, so Mark had shown you this picture earlier of the Midcontinent Gazette. This is one of the reference materials that we had with us when we were doing the initial exploration up there, and we got very excited about this publication. And most of it, the Midcontinent Railroad is really run by volunteers. There are a lot of guys that are very interested in railroads. And so on a sidetrack of research, one of their volunteers named Don Ginter came up with all of this information on the mining, and then eventually it turned into this article in this Gazette. Mark was able to track down Don Ginter, and he was in his 90s at the time, and he lived down just north of Beloit. And he invited us to come to his house for a few hours and go through his collection of materials which he had gathered to put together the article. And so he had no scanner or copying machine, and we went there with cell phones and cameras and took as many pictures of all of this collection of stuff that he had that we could in the 3 hours we were there. And amongst them were a number of photographs really showing the extent of the Illinois mine. In fact, most of his collection was based around the Illinois mine. That was his interest. And it turned out that because there was so much information, there was this common interest between Ginter, the interests of the Midcontinent Railroad and the Pierce family, their plans were to make a park on the Pierce family property and to really tell the history of the Illinois mine there by creating trails and having interpretive signs. And to show where, this full extent of operation, which was here at the Illinois mine, what it looked like today. However, most of it looked like foundations which are covered by snarls of wild weeds and overgrown shrubbery. So Don Pierce then in his retirement, bought himself a skid loader and started removing a lot of this and cleaned up some of the foundations. And this area would have been where the powerhouse is. And they cleared a bunch of trails on their property too, and they had a big vision for this property, which never came to fruition. Amongst his collection that Ginter had was a number of blueprints, and we found those to be very valuable. This is the Illinois mine, and we see here this is the rail cut which goes along here. This would have been the main shaft, which they're referring to as the number 3 shaft. And then the number 2 shaft here, which is open and diving. We didn't know where the number 1 shaft was, and that was really one of the things that we were going to go look for the next time we were out. Another thing within his collection, which we found very interesting, were plan view drawings of the crosscuts, which were created by the mining engineers. So we could see exactly where the drift was in reference to the shafts. Here's number 2. And here's number 1, and they don't connect at all with the underground working. So as Mark had said earlier in his drawing, it was very, very much a mystery as to what was going on. We have the railroad cut here with the main shaft, the 60-degree, the 60-degree decline here, and then the crosscuts going into the ore body. But we imagined that this would be, this line here would have been one of the exploratory shafts, one of the original shafts, or used later as a dewatering shaft. What's also very interesting is that they show that similar line continuing on the second level and going out. So our question was, if this is the dewatering shaft or that shaft number 1 or shaft number 2, it's coming all the way down to the first level, and the first level is here at about 300 feet. So we have over 300 foot of direct descent down that 3-compartment shaft down into the ore body. And when was this drawing made? Had they then later connected this down to the 4th level at the 400 foot? So these are questions that we had as divers. Where were we going? How deep did it actually go? Also really interesting within the collection was a couple of random pictures which Mark has attributed to some of these vertical shafts in the number 1 and the number 2, which gave us a little bit more of a feeling. I think this is the number 2 shaft just because of the geology that's in the background. So from there we started on a treasure hunt, and we decided to go walk transects through the swamp and see if we can find the number 1 shaft. And after this is Don Pierce, or Dennis Pierce, Don's middle son, and he was all too eager to walk through and help us walk these transects and look for anything. We were vastly unsuccessful, except for finding some holes that were spouting out water, and that really is the story of the Illinois mine, was that the pumps came out and the LaRue mines were flooded. So come back to this Midcontinent Railway Gazette for a number of reasons. You see that the photo on the front, it's very compelling. And it says Roberts Mine, North Freedom, Wisconsin. But if you read that publication, which I've read and combed through multiple times, it talks about the Illinois, it talks about the Iroquois, and it talks about the Cahoon. And the only mention of the Captain Roberts is the photo on the cover. So I thought that I missed it, or I was sleeping, or just inadequate in my following along. But there really isn't anything on the Roberts mine, and so it took a little bit of digging. And again, going through more pictures and more information within this Don Ginter collection, we found again a few more photos of the Roberts mine. We see the buildings here with, again, Mark showed you with the Illinois in the background, and the rail cut. So we should be able to find this on the landscape by what remnants are there today. We also had a number of clippings. He actually clipped things out and pasted them into a scrapbook, bless him. And so I copied a lot of these and put them onto a piece of paper, and we set off this is Memorial Day weekend in 2014 to try to find the Captain Roberts mine armed with these 4 newspaper articles and a couple historic images. And so we were driving down the highway into LaRue, and there was a guy cutting his lawn, and I thought that might be the right area, and we pulled over and we stopped, and it's actually the gentleman in the back, which is the background with the white hat, which is Greg Georgeson here. And he and his wife had their camper pulled up for the weekend on this property, and they were trimming the weeds, and I pulled over with my 4 pieces of paper, and I said, I don't know if I'm crazy, but I think that there's a mine on your property, or might have been, and I've been doing this research on the Illinois mine across the street. Would there be a mine here? Do you know what I'm talking about? Well, he said, oh my goodness, you're not going to believe what I have in my backyard. And so he walked us out there, and again, they have this fence, which they've, I guess, oversold in Baraboo. And they has this surrounding his hole in the ground, and he said, well, we've been trying to raise fish in this thing, and he said, but we imagined it was a mine shaft, and they really didn't know what was down there, but they were really willing to learn, and they wanted to know. He said to us, so he says, do you think you can dive here today? We'd already made arrangements to go diving over at the Pierce property. So I said, well, we should go diving over there because we already had talked to the landowner. I said, but we'll come over this afternoon. He says, well, if you come back, we're going to make you steak. So how could we say no? And I don't know if any of you are cavers or have gone out trying to get onto property. It never happens like this. But I have a little bit of video from John Scholes, which I want to show you, of what it looks like underwater in their property. So again, they didn't spend the 100 years throwing trash down the Captain Roberts, but you see this, we spent about 2 hours cleaning this out, and this is on the second day. And as he's dropping down, this is the first time we're dropping down with a camera and looking into the mine. And so as he drops down to 75 feet, we see the pipes going into the room, and here is that staged dewatering pump, which Mark hypothesizes may have been taken from the Illinois. The story is that when Captain Roberts, when they closed the Illinois in 1908, Captain Roberts didn't believe that the ore was done, and he obtained rights to the property across the road. And to drive his shaft, he had 23 men remain on to help him sink it. And he robbed power from the Illinois. Well, of course, he had the keys. So, and then it took him a few months to get enough money and to build the buildings himself and to bring his own boiler in and be able to start mining on that property. So if he was going to be robbing power from them, why not take equipment that was left too? So this may in fact be the pump that's missing over in the Illinois. So I'm swimming here, that's me in the picture here. I'm swimming forward of John Scholes, and I'm putting a guideline out. So that's very typical in cave diving, that you would run a guideline along so that if there are cross-cut tunnels, or you get lost, or something happens, you can find your way back out. And and as Mark was saying that in his article that he read, there was basically they had minutes to get out of the mine. I believe that, and I use this all the time. I say, oh, it's a time capsule. These things are time capsules. This is literally a time capsule. This was like run for your, they left their tools in place. There's an ore cart, a single ore cart on the track with a pickaxe in it. It's empty. And next to it stands a post drill, which has the bits still in the borehole and bits remaining at the base of it. And you can see the compressed air line running to it. By the way, we discovered when we were looking at some of the video of this that that was a very, very early post drill. It was not run with water. It was only run with compressed air. So that's what Mark calls the Widowmaker. And so here he is swimming down the tracks towards the end of the drift here. And as we're coming into this area, you can see I'm doing very specific kicks. These are used in cave diving to avoid stirring up the bottom. So I'm not doing the flutter kick, it's a frog kick, which throws the water up. And you can also see that I'm using a rebreather, which doesn't produce any bubbles. So there's no percolation falling on me from the ceiling, which is probably a good thing because I'm going into an area here which is framed off. And you see that above it is logs which have been split and put atop to form a ceiling to keep the rock from falling down onto the miners or the carts which are below. And as I swim further, you see balanced along the wall here is a scaling bar. And the scaling bar would have been used to pry and ram the ceiling before the workers would go down to try to get the rock to come loose so there wouldn't be any accidents. So, and you can see the compressed air lines on either side of the tracks, which are continuing in. And as we get all the way in here, there's a candle holder on the wall here with some wire wrapped around it. I don't believe that they had lighting, although they may have been attempting to put some in at some point. But we'll see later on in this video that they actually did mine this by candle because there's a number of tallow candles which are on the ceiling. I'm coming now to the end of the drift. And as I come down here, you see that there are rail tracks which are set along the side, spare ones to be put down as they would continue mining. And I tie off my line and attach it to the end of the rail track because the tunnel goes no further. So you can see that as I came out of the area too that was framed over the top, there had been a ceiling collapse or rock fall, and it's uncertain whether the ceiling had broken off or they had used that scaling bar to drop the ceiling, and then they were going to start cleaning that up, and in the process the pump broke and the mine flooded. But the one thing that we noticed when we were looking at the pump itself is that it had a toolbox which was set atop it with spare parts, and there was a toolbox set alongside it as well, which had tools which were sort of spewed out on the floor. So I do believe that this was the story with this particular mine when it closed anyway, was that they had been working on that pump. And that and the auxiliary pump were not working at all, and they had a matter of minutes to escape. So as we're heading back here, again, you can see some of the rail tracks which are set alongside this to continue. And we go back to where the drill is and the area that's stoped out in this area here. It's pretty amazing to think that this was mined only for a year and a half, and that they had this almost 160 feet of tunnel put in. So pretty amazing. So if you're setting up an exhibit on what it looked like to mine in the Baraboo Range, this is pretty much it. You see tools stacked alongside a shovel, a pickaxe, another scaling bar. And as I head over this way, I'm going to signal to John to come and check out the tallow candles above me. See the compressed air line running in as we approach the shaft. So he'll pan back up in a second here, and you'll see a number of these tallow candles, which these are all, animal fat candles, which are just scattered on the ceiling and left there. So either a box broke loose, or they had a stack of them set there at the entrance, and they were bringing them into the mine with them. As we come back into the shaft here too, he is going to go up the skip guides all the way to the surface. And you can see it's a very different looking shaft because it only had about 2 hours of cleaning, and well, again, not as many years of people throwing things into it. It was not the party spot. So we had the fortune in November of this year to have a visit from the 2017 Our World Underwater Rolex Scholar. So her name is Leah Potts, and she's here in the water. And she came to us. She wanted to have an experience in underwater archaeology, but she could only come to Wisconsin in November. So, but she came to us with, so we didn't want to take her on the Great Lakes because, the gales of November and all that. So we do the exciting part usually in archaeology of writing papers and cleaning up field equipment in November. So we decided, since she came to us with this unique set of skills, she was a cave diver. She knew how to dive on a rebreather. She's using this recirculating device. And that we would try to go up and take a look at the Captain Roberts mine here and see if we could survey this. So I was put up a challenge from my boss, the state archaeologist, John Broyhan. He sent me an article which was from the SHA, the Society for Historic Archaeology, saying that there was a lot of work that had been done on terrestrial sites, but not a whole lot that had continued underwater and looked at the underwater inundated workings of some of these mine sites. So the person in the foreground here is Paul Reckner. He is with the Museum Archaeology program at the Wisconsin Historical Society. He's a terrestrial archaeologist. Usually does DOT work, when they're moving a highway. He'll go out ahead of time and make sure they're not moving it on top of any important archaeological sites. So he came and helped us, and he surveyed a lot of the topside features. They're not very exciting. You see this is their burn pit, which actually at one time in its life had been the powerhouse for the Captain Roberts, but he discovered a lot of interesting things. You see here the mining graffiti that was written into the foundation. I have no idea what that reads, but I'm hopeful that this was only November when we collected this information, that it'll make sense in another couple months, and we'll be able to tell you what this means. Anybody want to guess? No? Do you think that's what it says? Oh, good. I see a whole lot of things. So again, we see here this unique and maybe first time where we have terrestrial archaeologists. This is Paul Reckner with the Trimble walking the collar of the mine with my colleague Caitlin Zant below, documenting the shaft. And so we were able to create a scaled drawing, a site plan of what we have underwater. And you can see that we've documented the entire drift. The shaft would have been here, and then the drift would continue on in this direction. You see two stopes, which are associated with the site. And this one would have been the primary one. That probably is where they were initiating some crosscuts, or had hoped to. And then over on the far side here, we have the pump room here, where everything, all the two dewatering pumps would have been set. Above here we have, in this area, a vertical cross-section. And we see, as Mark had explained, was typical in these mines to take the pressure off the pump, is that they would have a staged pumping area. So we have here the regular pump, dewatering pump on the bottom, and we have this area here, which would have been the staged area for pumping. May have been the first pumping as they were sinking the shaft, or it may have been one that they had set up and were anticipating as they were continuing deeper, because some of the articles that they had said they were going to 150 feet, and this is in fact only at 75. So maybe they had anticipated coming halfway up to this point now, and then putting another pump in here with the sump area beyond. So another thing Leah had as in her toolbox was she had just come to us from Malta, where she had learned some photogrammetry. So she had learned to take photos and create 3D models. So this is at a weird angle just so that you can get a full perspective of the ore cart. But you can see it's pretty nice. There's a couple little errors in the model, but you can't see the wheels on the one side. It was too close to the pump, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what that ore cart looks like. And we were also able to create this model of the post drill. If you look, the program extrapolated the boreholes out on the back side of the image, which is kind of interesting. And you can see the post drill here set up and working. So you see the holes extrapolated in the back. I think it's kind of fun. So Paul Reckner is able to finish his topside survey for us too, and in doing so, he acquired. So he surveyed where all the foundations were of the buildings that we could find. He figured out where the rail line had been, although there's very little evidence of it on the surface. But as you see across the street, it continues on and go through the cut that comes into the Illinois mine and the property across the road, and that is still extant. So he went and obtained some LiDAR images from Sauk County. And what's very interesting is, although we treat these as two separate sites, the Illinois and then the Captain Roberts across the street, it's kind of hard to separate sometimes, because we see here is that rail cut for the Illinois, and you can see where it came then across the road and connected with the Captain Roberts. Here's the shaft for the Captain Roberts, which exists, and the stream which comes out of it as it's flowing into the wetland. But what we did with this is we went back to that blueprint that Don Ginter had, and we superimposed the two. And we know that we were in the number 2 shaft, which lines up pretty well with this. And this gave us, and we see the rail cut here, and although this was produced in 1907, which was before the Captain Roberts was sunk, we can see then where the number 3 shaft is, and then also we can go back and find out where number 1 is. So we line this up on Google Earth. X marks the spot, and we decided to go back. But before we did, we came across some 1937 aerial photography, also of Sauk County, and we see some remnants on the landscape of where that number 1 shaft was. So here's your surprise. After tromping through that wetland, here it is. Isn't it obvious? The number 1 shaft. So Paul didn't, so I drove up on the drive while Paul and Dennis were walking the wetland, and I heard some hooping and hollering coming from out there, and help pull me out of this thing. And as you can see with the flagging tape, that is those are the tie rods which would have held the corners of the hoist. And so he's now marking those in, and John's trying to see if he can drop down into it. But they found it merely by chance in walking out to the coordinate that they had gained. So that's pretty fun. So in the upcoming months, we're going to spend a little bit more time putting some of this together. We collected this data in November, so it's sort of amazing that we're presenting on it now. So when you come to this presentation again, when we give it, I don't know where, it will probably be different, and we'll have a little bit more information to give you about what we find. Meantime, John wants to clear this out. This is his big plan. He's here in the audience. I'm going to make fun of him. To clear this out and possibly see where this one goes. As the other shaft on the Illinois only went down to 130 feet before we hit the bottom, maybe this one is the one that goes down to the 300 or 400 foot level. So we'll never know until we actually go, you know. So thank you. I hope there's so we can put another picture. This is the part where there's questions. So I'm gonna. So you want to turn back on your microphone? I'll put up a nice image.
No, if I ever turned it off. Is this working?
Oh, there you go. So any questions? You want to go ahead and take them? You take them and I'll answer.
Huh?
What was your water temp in the dive?
So it is groundwater. So it is 48 degrees. Yeah. Year-round.
Generally, groundwater assumes the average temperature of the terrain that it's in, the average annual temperature.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. The question was what is the temperature of the water? So, and yeah, it's groundwater, 48 degrees.
Yes, sir.
How far down can you dive?
How far down can you dive? In this mine or anywhere?
In one of these mines.
In one of these mines, okay. So the Illinois shaft is just a shaft. It's a 3-compartment shaft that goes straight down and goes nowhere. And that goes down to 130 feet. The Captain Roberts mine is 75 feet down to where you hit the drift, and that is as deep as you can go in that one. So the sump that they were working is in the bottom of the shaft. We found that out, but I don't know that I've told you that. Surprise! And the pipes go down right into it. So it's directly in the bottom of the shaft where the sump is. Okay.
That would be typical practice.
Theoretically, how deep could you go?
How deep can you go?
On a CCR.
Oh, geez, you know, there are guys that dive 300, 400 feet regularly. It depends on hypothermia, how cold can you get. So how cold do you want to get?
And how fast can you come back up without getting the bend?
Oh, okay, so how fast can you come up without getting the bend? So you can come up about 30 feet per minute. Is typical. So 60 used to be the old way. Now it's 30 feet, and then you'll have depending on how deep you were and how long you were down for, there'll be some decompression requirement.
Has anybody died at the bends in Wisconsin?
I imagine, yeah. I don't know for sure. So not in the mines. No one has died of the bends in the mines.
Interestingly enough, and Tammy can tell you more about this than I could, but a lot of the initial research on hyperbaric environments in decompression was done in Milwaukee when they were putting the caissons in for water supply out into Lake Michigan. They were working in a hyperbaric or high pressure environment to keep the water out. Problem was, when the workers came out after their shift, they were getting the bends. So they did a lot of research at St. Mary's Hospital, I believe, in Milwaukee. A lot of the pioneering research on the bends and decompression. Yes, in the back.
Did you find anything alive down there? Any fish, crayfish brought in?
Okay, so did we find anything alive? There are amphipods. We see those. So just little crustacean type things that float around, but I've seen nothing else. There are some goldfish that have been released by the landowners, so to occupy the imagination of their grandkids. I think that's it.
Frogs.
Yeah.
Frogs.
Frogs, lots of frogs. That's right. And plants.
Yes, sir.
The last picture, were you finding that shaft in the marsh there?
Yeah.
How was that so covered over the shaft hole is there? what was holding up the vegetation?
So what's holding up the vegetation over the shaft is the question, the one that's in the middle of the marsh. So a lot of organic debris. So 100 years of organic debris of the wetland and the marsh, a lot of reeds. It's basically a mat until you walk on top of it and break it up, and then you fall down to where there's a cap. So we believe that there are boards underneath, but that's at least chest deep. So.
Yes, sir.
Is the marsh, the wetlands, a result of the water coming out of the mine, or was it there previously and they just sunk it through the marsh?
The question is the marsh a result of water coming out of the old mines, or was it always a wetland? I suspect it was always a wetland, but water table fluctuates, and it could be that it was high and dry. When we look at the historic photos of the shaft sinking on that site, it looks pretty high and dry. So it's conceivable that in the interim between the 1903-ish, 4-ish, when they were starting this work, and today, that the water table has come up, and come up enough that it's now inundated that land. Yes, sir.
Dive question, what's the depth limit for rebreather?
Oh, the depth limit for rebreather. That depends on your training. So you can dive deep. It depends on with a regular rebreather, you're probably good to about 100 feet with air as your diluent. So you would use that to dilute the oxygen in your mixture as you go deeper. So you're blending your gas as you go. With more training, you would then be able to go with a mixed gas, and you could go to 300-400 feet deep with the rebreather. So that's not necessarily the limiting factor, but it may be your training and your experience. So.
Yes, sir.
My hometown is Crystal Falls, Michigan.
Aha.
But the mines up there, the stopes gradually, it's like a porcupine clove. They work their way up to the surface because they keep trickling down, filling, and finally it comes to, and you get a cave in.
Right.
These stopes don't do that?
Well, this is an entirely different formation. The iron ores.
Repeat the question.
I'm sorry. The question was, this gentleman, hometown is Crystal Falls, Michigan, which is also the hometown of C.T. Roberts, we've been talking about. C.T. Roberts cut a pretty broad swath in the mining industry up there before he was brought down here by International Harvester. But the question was, typically the old mines in the Crystal Falls area, the stopes would gradually slack or fall in until they reached the surface, and then suddenly you'd have a subsidence issue, a big crater. The formations up there, the iron ore is soft iron in the Crystal Falls area. The rock that it's enclosed in tends to be somewhat softer than the rock surrounding these mines. Also, being flooded, these mines have a certain amount of hydrostatic pressure in them that limits the cave-in. In other words, the water actually acts as a hydraulic support for the workings because they're flooded. I'll tell a very quick story because I know it's getting late. One of the lead and zinc mines, historic lead and zinc mines in southwestern Wisconsin, was quite rich, but it was closed during the economic depression following World War I. In the early 1950s, some entrepreneurs decided to open it again, and they started pumping it out. But when they did, they removed that hydrostatic pressure, and 20 acres on the top of the hillside started to sag. So that hydrostatic pressure actually does help hold up the workings. Yes, ma'am.
What is the pH of the water in these mines?
I don't know about the what is the pH of the water in the mines? I'm not sure about the Baraboo mines. The only one that I've tested pH in is down in southwestern Wisconsin, and that would have been the Pickett mine, and that's pH neutral. So, and that's merely because of the bacteria. But many of the mines are slightly acidic, as I understand.
Yeah, these are not acid mines. There's nothing sulfidic in these iron mines. So I would suspect the Baraboo mines would be dead nuts neutral. Yes, sir.
In the Roberts mine, where you were swimming through, was that iron ore? I mean, were you in a shaft that was ore, or were they trying to get to the ore? Or could you tell?
The question was, is in the video swimming through the Roberts workings, were they in ore or was it just development workings to get to ore? There's evidence that they were in some ore, and in fact, the records show that they did ship ore for a short period of time. So no, there was iron ore in there.
Yeah, the property was owned by the Thompson Furnace Company out of Milwaukee. And so there's records of 3 or 4 cars of ore going to them. So we know that it was at least marginally good quality ore coming out.
So it's just that one shaft. You went from end to end. That's the ore they got out of that mine. So
in a year and a half, yes. So that's all that they had involved in that.
We believe they had bigger plans. And you know, Tammy told part of the story, and I think it's very telltale, that there were tools and parts around that pump. And they were having, I believe, strongly believe, they were having difficulty with that pump. It got away from them, and the mine literally flooded overnight. And rather than try to pump it out, it was probably a borderline economic proposition. They decided to walk away. Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions. One, are the records located at like the Wisconsin Geologic Survey for the production? And then my second question is, have you guys dived into the mines in other parts of the state?
First question was, are there records of production? There are some records of production for some of the mines at the Geological Survey. The survey, and I think we have some survey folks here tonight. The survey was tasked originally to assess mines for the state severance tax. And so there are quite a few production records for Wisconsin mines still on file with the survey, including some of the Baraboo mines. So yes, some of that data is there. Some of the data we've also gleaned from old newspapers. Mining companies were very quick to talk up success. So if they were having good production, the local newspaper would hear about it. The second question is, have you been diving at other mines in the state? And the question is yes, and actually Tammy being, the diving into this.
They're supposed to stand in the light, so come on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, we've been diving in quite a few other places. We've been able to locate mines in several mines in southwestern Wisconsin. These are the only 2 in the Baraboo range that we've had access to for diving. We have been up north in a copper mine in the UP. I think that's about it. Yeah, so we're always looking. So if you know of anything, let us know. Willing landowners,
There's obviously still an element of danger when you put a human down there. How do you balance sending a human down versus some sort of automatic vehicle?
So we are very. So how do we assess the hazards of doing this? We're very cautious. So anytime you go in overhead of any kind, whether it be a shipwreck or a mine or a cave, you're always very cautious as to what your effect will be on it, whether it will collapse around you. We do run guidelines to make sure that if we should get lost or kick up the visibility, that we should be able to find our way out. There's no way to entirely mitigate the hazards or the dangers, and it's something that we, as a diver, you accept if you're going to be going into these type of things. Have we used robotics? No, we haven't. We've used drop cameras before to look down, but we have not used any kind of remote operated vehicle or anything like that to be able to look in. So you have tethers and other things to worry about, which can sometimes get tangled.
Yeah, and as you can see from this environment, it's a very cluttered environment. So it'd be very perilous in terms of getting a tangled tether and not being able to recover the ROV. John?
Did you mention for the audience that video of this and other mines is on YouTube?
So this is John Jansen. He's one of our great videographers and photographers, which I've been featuring here. He has a YouTube channel. Please visit. You just have to search his name, John Jansen, with a Z, like that. And you can see a number of videos of a lot of the inundated mines that we've visited. He's been doing a really excellent job of cataloging them by video and with photos. And they're there with a lot of views. Last time I looked, you were at like 7,000 views on your video, Wisconsin Red.
In the back.
What did they do with the water that they pumped out of the mine?
Well, the question is, what did they do with the water that they pumped out of the mine? Well, in that era, they spilled it out on the ground. I mean, it was as good as well water. So they would spill it out on the ground, and it would percolate back into the mine very, very slowly. Well, or maybe not so slowly. Yes, sir.
Is it conceivable that in the future, if there's a demand strong enough for iron ore, that this area would be exploited again?
The question is it conceivable that the iron ore resources of the Baraboo Range could ever be exploited in the future? The short answer is no, but yes. I mean, this is good iron ore. This is good iron ore, and there's a lot of it there. However, this is Wisconsin. I'll leave it at that. And also, the bulk of it is underground, and underground mining is always more expensive than open pit mining. So as long as there are quality iron reserves that are accessible by open pit mining, the underground mines will never happen. It's just economically disadvantaged because of the costs involved in going underground. But there is a lot of iron ore underground in the Baraboo Range, a lot of it, and it's good quality ore. It's probably going to stay there.
Question.
Yes?
So you said that I think the second mine, the Robertson mine?
Roberts
mine, filled in a matter of minutes, but everything looks so peaceful. Like the tools are standing up, the mine cart is standing up, and I'm having a hard time sort of rectifying that in my mind. In my mind, a flood is like a very violent, throwing things everywhere, but the scene I'm seeing is very peaceful. Can you explain that at all?
The question is, everything looks very peaceful underground in the Roberts mine. Isn't that inconsistent with rapid flooding? Well, the picture I'd like you to get in your mind is you're down on the beach, and you're playing in the sand, and you dig a hole in the sand, and you dig down, and the sand starts to get damp, and all of a sudden the water starts filling into that sand hole. It's not violent, it doesn't churn, the water just comes up, and it comes up quickly. And that's what would have happened at the Roberts Mine. It wasn't any Hollywood-style gushing flood down the passageway. The water just came up rapidly but relentlessly, and it wouldn't have disturbed.
Not from the sides.
Not from the sides. Well, it might have wept in a little from the sides, but it would have been gentle but relentless. But no gushing, no rapids, no spouting. Yes, sir.
Is the goal of this just to kind of like document them and, you know, obviously make these nice videos and stuff like that? Does that just kind of show where they are, what was there?
So the question is, what's the point? I think. So yes, it's to catalog this, to understand why things are where they are, why they were left there, how they went about some of these mining practices, to get as much information from it as possible. So this particular site, I filed, the Captain Roberts Mine, I filed an inquiry to see if it would be eligible for the National Register. And they said, yes, pursue it. So the property board said, look into it and see, provide us with more information. We'd love to explore the possibility. And if that's the case, it could be protected. And the landowners are very keen to protect what it is too. They understand that what they have is very special. It's a very unique place, and it tells a very unique part of Wisconsin history, just like that. So it is a time capsule. So it's our job now to protect it as one. So. Hope that answered your question in a
my
vague, weird
comparison,
way.
I think, to a shipwreck is apt. It's flooded, it is preserved as it was the last day humans worked there. And I think in and of itself, that creates real value in getting a picture of what was going on in rural Sauk County in 1910, 1911.
If I could
Yes.
make an analogy, a shipwreck that goes down and it crashes, this in a matter of hours was preserved as it was. And you call it a snapshot or whatever.
Time capsule.
That's what's amazing. Of the two mines, Robert's mine overnight became, I mean, it was left as it was. Nothing was salvaged out of it or anything like that. It's astonishing.
Yes, ma'am.
And that kind of has to do with my question. So they just left these and people have these little fences around holes in them? So you could walk upon and fall in or?
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard the question, but the question is open shafts. You know, I mean, does this make any sense? Wisconsin does have a shaft fencing regulation. You are supposed to do certain things to protect open shafts from the innocent, if you will. But over the years, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mine shafts in Wisconsin in various places. Some landowners have been more proactive about doing things with them. Everything from throwing dead livestock into them, to old cars, to paint buckets, to dumping tons of rock into them, or to putting fences, whether they're barbed wire or decorative, around them. So you see the spectrum of land management with respect to old mine lands. It falls to the landowner to comply or not, or do whatever they want to it. Now, if somebody stumbles into their mine and decides to bring a lawsuit, that's their problem.
But the companies didn't have any obligation to do anything?
In that time, they did not. Yes, Tom?
When you have the mines go lateral like that, who owns the mine to go from one property line to the next?
That's a very good question. Tom is asking who owns the rights, the mineral rights, as a mine proceeds horizontally. These are not federal mine lands. The federal lands to the west are subject to the mining law of 1872. That's so-called law of the apex. I won't get too far out on it, but basically what it says is,
question, way to go.
if you find an ore deposit on the surface, you can follow it down no matter whose land it goes under, and it's yours. If you find it, follow it and it's yours. If it goes under Joe Smith's land, Joe Smith's out of luck. You found it. In Wisconsin, mineral rights go under your feet. So if you go across a surface property line, you better negotiate a lease with the neighbor. 99% of the mining that was done in Wisconsin was not what they call, well, I'm getting legal again. 99% of the mining that was done in Wisconsin was by lease. You would lease the mineral rights and pay the landowner a royalty on the mineral that you extracted. That's one reason why the mine maps from Wisconsin were so good. Every month they'd send in the survey team and map it so they knew how much to pay Frank Smith and how much to pay John Jones. They have to map it all out. So in that sense, we're lucky. But 99% was by lease. Very few mining companies acquired fee simple on the mineral estate. Yes, sir.
Certainly after all this work, it's deserved. Did you get the steak dinner?
That and more. Tammy alluded to it, but these landowners are fantastic. We've had some lunches served up there that, you know, I'd pay for it.
Yeah, the Pierce property is pretty interesting too. Like I said, they like to party around their shaft. And John's come up from a dive with his big camera. We get the camera out of the water. Just as soon as we get that, he's got a beer in his hand, and so he hasn't even climbed out of the water. He's standing there with his dive gear on and a beer. So they're very very amenable to us being there.
Very
they're very
hospitable.
excited about what they have and what part of history they share.
Yes, sir.
Back up to Crystal Falls, east of Crystal Falls, the Mansfield mine, the stope was underneath, essentially underneath the Michigan River. They got too much too big, and the river collapsed. The river flooded the mine. Many died in that particular incident. Is that a mine that you would be of interest of exploring?
I'm going to guess yes.
It would depend. So, the access to it is very, if it's easy, if it's not entirely, well, come on, John. John's saying thumbs up. So, sure, we would be interested in exploring that. So, I have not heard of that. I'm sure Mark hasn't shared it with us.
There were a number of, the issue is historic mines that flooded for one reason or another, and there were quite a few of those in the Upper Peninsula over the years. The Barnes-Hecker disaster near Ishpeming and Mansfield that you were talking about. Various things happened, but more often than not, there was a surface subsidence near flowing water, and the water came down into the workings, and either you got out or you didn't.
Is there any potential for the Railroad Museum and the folks that are interested in the mining aspect to have some joint exhibitry at the Railroad Museum?
Okay. Yeah, so the question is about the Midcontinent Railway Museum. They do have an exhibit there on the mines of the Baraboo Range and the what would you call it? What are the rail spurs? The rail spurs that went to them, the individual spurs, what the timelines were of them, how they were utilized, and that is on one of the walls right as you walk in. So that is already there. As far as continuing on with I think their plan was, I did read part of this plan, was that they would stop the train. Usually they come through LaRue and they go back to a quarry, and they turn the train around and they head back to North Freedom. But the plan was that they would have an optional stop where you could stop in LaRue, have a pizza at that restaurant that used to be there that was great, the bar restaurant, and it's not there anymore, unfortunately. Anybody want to open it? Because it would be great. But stop there, and then people could have lunch and walk the trails and look at the signage. I don't know whether there's a future for that. I'm not sure that Don Pierce has passed away. The sons now jointly own the property. They're happy they have an ATV trail that they run around in there, and they love it, and it's very recreational property for them, for the Illinois. And the other property is less than an acre. So I don't know, maybe a sign there or something in the future, maybe so, or an easement, a protective easement of some sort.
Tom, I'm talking a little out of school here, but as I understand it, that museum is very heavily reliant on grants, and a lot of their grants are targeted now at a couple of other things, a bridge rehab and rebuilding their steam locomotives. So they've got a lot of irons in the fire that probably would slow that kind of thing up.
One more question? One more, here we go.
How did you first get involved in cave diving?
Yeah. How did I get involved in cave diving? So I was, I've always been very interested in caves. I grew up in Indiana, and we did a little bit of dry caving there in high school. So one of my best friends, her father was worked for the Indianapolis Star. And his name was Bio Bill Cyphers, and he was the outdoor adventure writer. And he would take us on these wild adventures, and I loved when we would go caving. And so I grew up caving, and I came to school here in Wisconsin, and I went caving, and I joined WSS. And so I learned to dive here at the University of Wisconsin when it was offered as a class. And when it was offered for me to do cavern and cave diving when I was on a trip, I jumped right in and I fell in love. So there's a lot of really cool places you can go to, and I really love the challenge of the logistics of diving in overhead environments.
What Tammy isn't telling you is, what she isn't telling you, she's sleep deprived because she just got back from a week of cave diving in Florida.
So anytime, I'm a sucker for it.
Thanks very much.